Sometimes the hardest fall is from a life you thought you'd earned. Marcus Chen had once believed that talent and hard work were enough until the day his world collapsed and left him standing outside a restaurant he could no longer afford to enter. 6 months ago, he wore expensive suits and commanded boardrooms in Silicon Valley. Now he clutched a warm backpack, watching wealthy diners pass by while his stomach cramped with hunger. When CEO Jonathan Whitmore stepped outside, the man who had destroyed his career with a single phone call spotted Marcus and smiled with cruel amusement. "Clean my shoes," Whitmore laughed, dropping a $20 bill at Marcus's feet, "and I'll give you my leftovers." Marcus stared at the money, then at the polished leather shoes. Something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes. What happens when you humiliate a genius who has nothing left to lose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crumpled $20 bill lay between them like a bridge Marcus refused to cross. But as Whitmore's laughter echoed off the marble facade, Marcus's mind drifted to a different time, when respect came naturally and his future seemed limitless. 18 months earlier, Marcus Chen had walked through the gleaming corridors of Technova Solutions with the confidence of someone who belonged. The startup's open floor plan buzzed with creative energy, punctuated by the gentle hum of high-end computers and the occasional burst of laughter from the ping-pong table. His badge employee number 0847, senior algorithm developer, hung proudly. From a retractable cord, the magnetic strip worn smooth from countless swipes through security doors. "Marcus, you've outdone yourself again," Sarah Kim had said that Tuesday morning, her eyes bright with excitement as she reviewed his latest code on her monitor. Sarah was one of the few senior developers who had taken him under her wing when he'd started as an intern 2 years prior. A desk sat adjacent to his in the coveted corner section reserved for the company's top talent, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. The algorithm Marcus had developed was elegantly simple, yet revolutionary. A machine learning model that could predict user behavior with 93% accuracy while using 40% less processing power than existing solutions. It was the kind of breakthrough that could redefine how tech companies approached data analysis, potentially saving millions in server costs while delivering better user experiences. "The investors are going to lose their minds when they see this," Sarah continued, scrolling through the performance metrics. "Do you realize what you've created here?" Marcus had smiled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he leaned back in his ergonomic chair. The moderate-sized apartment he rented in Daly City might not have been luxury, but it represented something his parents had never had: stability, success, the American dream, realized through merit and hard work. His mother still kept his college graduation photo prominently displayed in their small kitchen, next to the immigration papers that had brought the Chen family to America when Marcus was 12. "It's just pattern recognition taken to its logical conclusion," Marcus had replied with characteristic modesty. "The computational efficiency comes from eliminating redundant neural pathways and focusing on behavioral clusters rather than individual data points." Sarah had laughed. "Just pattern recognition?" "Marcus, this could revolutionize personalized marketing, content delivery, even medical diagnosis algorithms. You're talking about technology that could impact millions of lives." The memory of that conversation now felt like a dream from another person's life. Marcus remembered how he'd spent that evening refining the code, working late into the night, not because he had to, but because he loved the challenge. The office's after-hours quietude had become his sanctuary, broken only by the soft clicking of his keyboard and the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Technova's culture had felt like a family in those days. The company's founder, David Park, regularly hosted Friday evening gatherings where employees shared their latest projects over craft beer and artisanal pizza. Marcus had presented his algorithm at one such gathering, watching as his colleagues' faces lit up with understanding and admiration. Even the interns had stopped their conversations to listen, recognizing they were witnessing something special. "This is the kind of innovation that puts us on the map," Park had said afterward, pulling Marcus aside. "I'm talking about patents, licensing deals, maybe even acquisition interest from the big players. You've just given us a significant competitive advantage." The praise had felt genuine, untainted by the corporate politics that Marcus had heard plagued larger companies. Technova operated with the scrappy determination of a startup where everyone's contribution mattered, where brilliance was rewarded regardless of hierarchy or tenure. Marcus had believed he'd found his place in the world. His parents had been quietly proud. When he'd explained his promotion to senior developer over dinner at their favorite dim sum restaurant in Chinatown, his father, who had worked double shifts at an electronics repair shop to support the family, had nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose sacrifices were finally bearing fruit. "You're building something that will last," his mother had said in Mandarin, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. "Something that helps people." Marcus had carried that sense of purpose through the following months as his algorithm underwent testing and refinement. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Beta clients reported unprecedented improvements in user engagement and operational efficiency. Industry blogs began publishing speculative articles about Technova's mysterious new technology, driving up the company's valuation and attracting attention from major investors. It was during this period of mounting success that Marcus first encountered Jonathan Whitmore, the CEO of Meridian Technologies, a mid-sized firm specializing in data analytics, had requested a meeting with Technova's leadership to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Marcus had been asked to attend as the algorithm's creator, an honor that felt like recognition of his growing importance to the company. Whitmore had arrived in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, his silver hair perfectly styled and his smile polished to the point of artificiality. He'd listened intently as Marcus explained the algorithm's functionality, asking pointed technical questions that demonstrated a deeper understanding than Marcus had expected from a CEO. "Impressive work," Whitmore had said afterward, his handshake lasting a moment longer than necessary. "You have a rare gift for seeing patterns others miss. I hope Technova appreciates what they have in you." The comment had felt like a compliment at the time, but Marcus now recognized it as something more calculating, a predator sizing up its prey. Whitmore had been studying him, identifying weaknesses and opportunities for exploitation. The charming executive had been planning Marcus's downfall from that very first handshake. The weeks following that meeting had brought a series of subtle changes that Marcus's trusting nature had failed to recognize as warning signs. Conversations would pause when he entered rooms. Sarah had become distracted and evasive when he asked about upcoming projects. Most telling of all, access to certain company servers containing the most sensitive intellectual property, had been quietly restricted without explanation. "It's just routine security updates," Park had assured him when Marcus finally asked about the access changes. "You know how paranoid our legal team gets about protecting proprietary technology." Marcus had accepted the explanation because he'd wanted to believe it. The alternative, that his colleagues were losing trust in him, seemed impossible given his track record and contributions. He'd continued working with the same passion and dedication, unaware that forces beyond his understanding were already in motion. The end, when it came, had been swift and brutal. A Tuesday morning that had started like any other was shattered by a call to Park's office, where Marcus found himself facing not just his boss, but the company's head of security and legal counsel. The atmosphere was arctic, professional courtesy stripped away to reveal cold accusation. We have evidence that you've been sharing proprietary code with outside parties, Park had said, his voice hollow with disappointment, specifically with Meridian Technologies. The accusation had hit Marcus like a physical blow. He tried to protest, to explain that he'd never shared anything with anyone, but the evidence fabricated emails, doctored server logs, testimonies from colleagues who seemed to believe he was guilty had been overwhelming. His badge had been deactivated immediately, his personal belongings packed into a cardboard box, while security watch Sarah had been the only one to meet his eyes as he was escorted out. And even she had looked away after a moment, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. The woman who had been his mentor and friend now saw him as a traitor, someone who had violated the trust that bound their professional family together. The legal battle that followed had been a masterclass in corporate character assassination. Whitmore's lawyers had presented a narrative so compelling and detailed that even Marcus began to doubt his own innocence. Phone records, email timestamps, financial transactions, every aspect of his life had been dissected and recontextualized to support their version of events. His savings had evaporated within weeks, consumed by legal fees and the cost of trying to clear his name. Job applications went unanswered as word of his alleged crimes spread through Silicon Valley's tight-knit community. Friends stopped returning his calls. His apartment lease wasn't renewed. The steady progression of his life had become a freefall with no visible bottom. Standing now outside Le Bernardin, Marcus understood with crystalline clarity how Whitmore had orchestrated every aspect of his destruction. The CEO had identified a valuable target, studied his weaknesses, and executed a plan with surgical precision. Marcus's trusting nature, his belief in merit-based success, his confidence in the system's fairness, all had been weapons turned against him. The $20 bill still lay at his feet, Whitmore's offer hanging in the air like a challenge to whatever dignity Marcus had left. Around them, the city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding on the sidewalk. The autumn evening carried the scent of expensive food and the sound of laughter from people whose worst problems could be solved. With money, Marcus looked up from the crumpled bill to meet Whitmore's expectant gaze. In that moment, he made a choice that would define everything that followed. Not the choice Whitmore expected, but one that drew from reserves of strength the CEO couldn't have imagined. Marcus stepped around the money without touching it and walked away, leaving Whitmore standing alone with his cruel offer and empty laughter. Behind him, he heard Whitmore's voice calling out with mock sympathy, "Offer stands any time you change your mind." But Marcus was already changing, becoming something harder and more dangerous than the naive developer who had trusted in fairness and merit. As he disappeared into the city's anonymous crowds, a plan began forming in his mind, not for revenge, but for justice. And justice, Marcus was learning, required a patience and precision that his former tormentor would never see coming. The termination letter had arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by certified mail to ensure Marcus couldn't claim ignorance of its contents. The formal Tech Nova letterhead, once a symbol of his professional identity, now served as the instrument of his destruction. But it wasn't until months later, living on the streets with nothing but time to think, that Marcus began to piece together the true scope of Jonathan Whitmore's betrayal. The letter itself was a masterpiece of legal precision, each word carefully chosen to maximize damage while minimizing liability. Effective immediately. Your employment with Technova Solutions is terminated due to violations of your confidentiality agreement, specifically the unauthorized sharing of proprietary algorithms with competing entities. The signatures at the bottom, David Park's familiar scrawl alongside. The more formal script of the legal department had felt like physical wounds, what Marcus hadn't understood then, but saw clearly now through the lens of his current desperation, was how methodically Whitmore had constructed his downfall. The process had begun weeks before their first meeting. With careful research into Technova's internal structure and identification of its most valuable assets. Marcus's algorithm hadn't just caught Whitmore's attention, it had become his target. The morning of his termination, Marcus had been summoned to Park's office under the pretense of discussing a new project assignment. He'd arrived early, eager to contribute to whatever challenge lay ahead, his mind already spinning with possibilities for innovation. The conference room held an unexpected gathering. Park sat at the head of the table, flanked by Janet Morrison from legal and Mike Stevens, the head of security, whose presence immediately set Marcus on edge. "Marcus, please sit down," Park had said, his usual warmth replaced by an uncomfortable formality. "We need to discuss some serious allegations that have come to our attention." The word allegations had sent a chill through Marcus's chest, but he'd maintained his composure, trusting that whatever misunderstanding had occurred could be cleared up with honest explanation. Of course. What kind of allegations? Morrison had opened a thick folder, removing printed emails and server logs with the careful precision of someone presenting evidence in court. "We have documentation showing that you've been in contact with Jonathan Whitmore of Meridian Technologies, sharing details about your algorithm development in violation of your employment agreement." The accusation had been so absurd that Marcus had initially laughed, a sound that echoed uncomfortably in the silent room. "That's impossible. I've never shared anything with Meridian. I met Whitmore once briefly during his presentation here, but we've never had any private communications." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Stevens had injected, sliding a series of printed emails across the table. The messages bore Marcus's Technova email address and contained detailed descriptions of his algorithm's functionality, apparently sent to an address registered to Meridian Technologies over the course of several weeks. Marcus had stared at the printouts in growing horror. The emails were written in his style, contained technical details only he would know, and included personal observations that seemed authentically his. But he had never written them, never sent them, never betrayed the company that had given him his first real opportunity for success. "This is some kind of mistake," he'd insisted, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "I never sent these emails. Someone must have compromised my account, or these have been fabricated somehow." Morrison's expression had remained professionally neutral, but Marcus had caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd heard such denials before. "We've had our IT department conduct a thorough investigation. The emails originated from your workstation during hours when you were logged in. The metadata is consistent with genuine communications from your account." The technical details had been overwhelming, but what devastated Marcus most was the look in Park's eyes, disappointment so profound it seemed to physically weigh down his shoulders. This was a man who had believed in Marcus's potential, who had championed his promotion, and celebrated his innovations. Now, he sat in judgment, forced to reconcile his faith in an employee with evidence of betrayal. "David, you know me," Marcus had pleaded, abandoning formality in desperation. "You know I would never do something like this. Technova isn't just my employer, it's my family. Why would I sabotage everything we've built together?" Park had closed his eyes briefly, as if the conversation caused him physical pain. "That's what makes this so difficult, Marcus. I don't want to believe it, but the evidence is clear, and Meridian has already filed a preliminary patent application for technology remarkably similar to your algorithm. The timing suggests they had inside information that could only have come from you." The revelation about the patent application had felt like a second blow, this one striking at Marcus's professional identity. His algorithm, the code he'd crafted with such care, the innovation that represented months of dedicated work, was being claimed by the very company that had orchestrated his downfall. "They're stealing my work," Marcus had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you see? This is all part of their plan." They've somehow faked these communications to create justification for taking my algorithm." Stevens had leaned forward, his security background evident in his direct approach. "If that's true, then you should be able to provide evidence of the deception. Alternative explanations for how these emails were created. Some proof that your account was compromised or that the communications were fabricated." But Marcus had no such evidence. His faith in the system's security had left him vulnerable to attacks he'd never imagined possible. The company's network infrastructure, which he trusted to protect his work, had been turned against him with surgical precision. The meeting had concluded with his immediate termination and the surrender of all company property. His badge was deactivated, his computer access revoked, his keycard privileges suspended. Security had escorted him to his desk to collect personal belongings under the watchful eyes of colleagues who whispered among themselves about his alleged crimes. Sarah had been the hardest to face. She'd approached him as he packed his few personal items into a cardboard box, her expression torn between loyalty and doubt. "Marcus, just tell me the truth," she'd said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Did you really share the algorithm with Meridian?" The question had cut deeper than any official accusation because it came from someone whose opinion he valued above all others. Sarah had been his mentor, his friend, sometimes his closest confidant during late-night coding sessions. If she doubted him, what hope did he have of convincing anyone else of his innocence? "Sarah, I swear to you, I never betrayed this company. I don't know how those emails were created, but I didn't send them. You have to believe me." She'd studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of deception or confirmation of innocence. Finally, she'd nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "I want to believe you, Marcus, but the evidence is so comprehensive. How could someone fake all of this without inside knowledge?" It was a question that would haunt Marcus through the months that followed. How indeed? The answer, he now realized, lay in understanding Jonathan Whitmore not as a legitimate businessman, but as a predator who had perfected the art of corporate theft. Whitmore's plan had been elegant in its simplicity. First, identify a valuable target, a small company with innovative technology, but limited resources for legal protection. Second, gain inside knowledge through seemingly legitimate business meetings and industry connections. Third, create a credible narrative of theft that would justify acquiring the technology while destroying the creators' ability to fight back. The fake emails had been the cornerstone of the deception, crafted by experts who understood both the technical aspects of email spoofing and the psychological elements that would make them believable. By using Marcus's actual writing style, incorporating real technical details, and timing the communications to coincide with his known work schedule, Whitmore's team had created evidence so convincing that even Marcus's closest colleagues couldn't dismiss it. The patent application had provided the final piece of the puzzle, creating urgency that prevented thorough investigation. With Meridian claiming prior development of the technology, Technova's leadership had been forced to choose between defending an apparently treacherous employee or protecting the company's remaining intellectual property. The choice had been inevitable. Marcus had spent weeks after his termination trying to rebuild his reputation, reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts who might vouch for his character. But Whitmore's campaign had been thorough. Rumors of his alleged betrayal had spread through Silicon Valley's interconnected community with viral efficiency. Job applications went unanswered. Networking meetings were canceled. Even his professional references became reluctant to associate with his tainted name. The legal battle that followed had been equally hopeless. Whitmore's resources far exceeded anything Marcus could marshal, and the evidence against him seemed ironclad to outside observers. His savings had disappeared into legal fees for attorneys, who eventually advised him that fighting the accusations would only compound his Financial ruin. The psychological toll had been perhaps the worst aspect of his ordeal. Months of being treated as a pariah had gradually eroded his confidence in his own memory and judgment. Had he somehow inadvertently compromised company security? Could there be some innocent explanation for the evidence against him? The constant doubt had eaten away at his sense of self until he barely recognized the person he'd become. Living on the streets had provided an unexpected clarity. Stripped of comfort and pretense, forced to focus on basic survival, Marcus had gained a perspective that his former privileged position had obscured. He could see Whitmore's manipulation with crystalline clarity now, understanding each step of the process that had led to his destruction. The termination letter remained folded in his backpack, a reminder of how quickly success could transform into devastation. But it had also become something else, evidence of a crime that Marcus was finally beginning to understand how to prove. Whitmore had been meticulous in his planning, but even the most careful predator left traces for those who knew how to look. As Marcus walked away from Le Bernardin and Whitmore's mocking laughter, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. The man who had destroyed his life out of greed and cruelty had just made a critical error. He'd revealed that. He remembered Marcus, that he took pleasure in his victim's suffering, that he felt secure enough in his victory to indulge in public humiliation. The Whitmore had underestimated what his victim had learned during his time in the wilderness. Marcus was no longer the trusting developer who believed the system would protect the innocent. He'd become something harder and more dangerous, someone who understood that justice sometimes required taking matters into your own hands. The termination letter had ended one chapter of his life. Now, walking through the city streets with nothing but determination and a growing plan, Marcus was ready to begin writing the next one. The wallet had been lying in a puddle outside the Starbucks on Market Street, its brown leather darkened by rainwater and neglect. Marcus had almost walked past it. His first months on the streets had taught him that investigating every discarded item was a waste of precious energy. But something about the way the late afternoon sun caught the edge of a plastic card made him pause and look closer. Inside, among the soggy receipts and worthless credit cards that had already been canceled, he found it, a San Francisco Public Library card bearing the name Thomas Chen. No relation, despite the shared surname, but the coincidence felt like a sign from whatever benevolent force might still be watching over his life. The card had been issued 3 years earlier and wouldn't expire for another. To a golden ticket to resources Marcus had begun to believe were beyond his reach. The months following his encounter with Whitmore had been a masterclass in urban survival. Marcus had learned that homelessness wasn't just about lacking shelter. It was about becoming invisible to a society that preferred to pretend people like him didn't exist. The same sidewalks he'd once walked with confidence as a tech professional now felt like hostile territory where his presence was merely tolerated. His first night sleeping rough had been spent in a doorway near his former apartment building, still clinging to the hope that his situation was temporary. He'd awakened to a security guard's flashlight and a firm directive to move along, beginning an education in the constant motion required to avoid arrest or harassment. Churches offered meals, but limited hours. Shelters provided beds, but came with waiting lists and rules that felt designed to exclude rather than include. It was during those early weeks that Marcus encountered others who had fallen through society's cracks. There was Elena, a former nurse whose medical career had ended when chronic pain led to prescription drug addiction. She taught him which restaurants threw away perfectly good food and which dumpsters were safe to search. A knowledge of the city's hidden geography, the places where homeless people could rest without immediate eviction, had quite literally saved his life. Then there was Robert, whose brilliant mind had once designed aircraft navigation systems for Boeing. A diagnosis of bipolar disorder, combined with a messy divorce and job loss, had started his downward spiral. But Robert still carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood complex systems, and his insights into human nature had helped Marcus navigate the social dynamics of street life. The key, Robert had explained during one of their late-night conversations in a 24-hour laundromat, is to remember that you're still the same person you were before. The circumstances changed, not your fundamental worth. Don't let them convince you otherwise. It was advice Marcus tried to follow, though some days were harder than others. The physical discomfort of sleeping outdoors was manageable compared to the psychological impact of being treated as less than human. Store owners who had once welcomed his business now watched him with suspicion. Former colleagues crossed streets to avoid awkward encounters. Even well-meaning charity workers spoke to him with the careful tone reserved for children or the mentally impaired. The library card changed everything. Marcus's first visit to the main branch on Larkin Street had been tentative, uncertain whether his disheveled appearance would trigger immediate ejection. But the security guard had barely glanced at his ID, and suddenly Marcus found himself in a temple of knowledge that welcomed everyone equally. The computers were his first priority. 45-minute sessions weren't long enough for serious programming work, but they allowed him to maintain some connection to the digital world that had once been his home. Email accounts could be checked, though the messages were increasingly sparse as former contacts gave up trying to reach him. Job searches could be conducted, though his tainted reputation made responses unlikely. More importantly, the library provided a safe space where Marcus could think and plan without the constant pressure of finding food or shelter. The reading rooms were quiet sanctuaries where he could spread out newspapers and magazines, researching Whitmore's company and looking for patterns that might reveal vulnerabilities. It was during one of these research sessions that Marcus discovered he wasn't Whitmore's only victim. Buried in trade publications and court records, he found references to other small companies that had been acquired by Meridian under suspicious circumstances. Always the same pattern: a period of collaboration followed by accusations of intellectual property theft, leading to quick settlements that transferred valuable technology to Whitmore's control. The legal documents were carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, but the timeline was damning. 3 companies in 4 years had lost their most valuable innovations to Meridian after brief periods of partnership discussions. The settlements included non-disclosure agreements that prevented the victims from publicly discussing their experiences, creating a wall of silence around Whitmore's predatory practices. Finding something interesting? The voice belonged to Sarah, Kim, who had somehow approached his table without him noticing. Marcus's heart jumped as he looked up to see his former mentor standing beside him, her expression unreadable. She wore a casual sweater and jeans weekend clothes that suggested this encounter was accidental rather than planned. Sarah. His voice came out rougher than intended, months of disuse having changed even the way he spoke. I didn't expect to see you here. She gestured to the empty chair across from him. May I? Marcus nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance. He'd done his best to stay clean, using public restrooms and the occasional shower at a community center, but there was no hiding the toll that street life had taken. His clothes, purchased from thrift stores with carefully hoarded dollars, hung loose on his diminished frame. I come here sometimes on weekends, Sarah said, settling into the chair. It's peaceful. Good place to think. She paused, studying his face. How are you holding up, Marcus? The question was loaded with meaning. She could see exactly how he was holding up poorly, desperately, clinging to whatever dignity he could maintain. But her tone suggested genuine concern rather than pity, and that small kindness nearly broke his composure. I've been better, he admitted. But I'm surviving. Learning things I never expected to learn. Sarah glanced at the papers spread across his table, printouts of court documents and news articles, all related to Meridian Technologies. Still trying to prove your innocence? Not just my innocence. Marcus gathered the documents, suddenly aware that his research might be interpreted as obsession rather than investigation. I'm starting to understand that what happened to me wasn't personal. It was business. What do you mean? Marcus hesitated. Sarah had been his closest ally at Technova, but she'd also been present during his termination. I'd seen the evidence that convicted him in the eyes of his colleagues. Could he trust her with his growing suspicions about Whitmore's systematic targeting of innovative companies? I think Meridian has done this before, he said carefully. The pattern is always the same. Collaboration discussions, followed by accusations of intellectual property theft, followed by acquisition of the technology in question. Sarah frowned. That's a serious accusation, Marcus. You're talking about organized corporate espionage. I'm talking about the only explanation that makes sense. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. Think about it, Sarah. You knew me better than anyone at Technova. Did you really believe I was capable of betraying the company? The question hung between them like a bridge Sarah could either cross or refuse. Marcus watched as she wrestled with competing loyalties, her affection for him as a colleague and friend versus her belief in the evidence that had seemed so compelling. I wanted to believe you were innocent, she said finally. But the emails were so detailed, so technically accurate. Who else could have written them? Someone who had access to my work, my writing style, my technical knowledge. Someone who spent enough time studying Technova to understand our internal processes and development timeline. Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper notes he'd compiled during his research. I found 3 other companies that lost valuable technology to Meridian under similar circumstances. Always after initial collaboration meetings. Always. Followed by accusations that forced quick settlements. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Sarah studied his notes, her programmer's mind automatically analyzing the data for connections and anomalies. Marcus could see the moment when understanding began to dawn, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the systematic nature of what he was describing. If this is true, she said slowly, then Whitmore didn't just steal your algorithm. He destroyed your life as collateral damage in a larger scheme. Worse than that, he enjoyed it. You should have seen his face when he offered me money to clean his shoes. This isn't just business for him. It's entertainment. The anger in Marcus's voice seemed to surprise Sarah. The gentle, soft-spoken developer she'd known had been replaced by someone harder, more direct. The streets had burned away his naive faith in fairness and merit, leaving behind someone who understood the world's capacity for cruelty. What are you going to do? She asked. Marcus looked around the libraries, reading room, taking in the quiet concentration of other patrons, pursuing their own forms of research and learning. This place had become his fortress, his planning center, his connection to the intellectual world he'd been exiled from. The stolen library card had given him more than just access to computers and databases. It had restored his sense of purpose. I'm going to prove what he did, Marcus said. Not just to me, but to all of us. And then I'm going to make sure he faces consequences for it. Sarah studied his face, perhaps recognizing the determination that had once driven him to create breakthrough algorithms. That's going to require resources you don't have. Legal fees, technical expertise, political connections. Whitmore has all of those things and more. Then I'll have to be smarter than he is. More patient, more careful. Marcus gathered his research, materials, his movements deliberate and controlled. He made one mistake, Sarah. He underestimated what his victims were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Marcus. That's my personal email, she said. If you need help with your research, or if you find something that needs verification, contact me privately." Marcus stared at the card, understanding the risk Sarah was taking by maintaining contact with someone Technova had branded a traitor. A willingness to help represented the first crack in the wall of isolation Whitmore had built around him. "Why?" he asked. Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. "Because I never stopped believing in the person you were. And maybe, just maybe, you're still that person." Walking out of the library that evening, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his termination: hope. The stolen library card had given him access to information and resources. Sarah's support had provided him with a potential ally who understood both his character and the technical aspects of his work. Most importantly, his research had revealed that Whitmore's crimes extended far beyond personal revenge. The wallet that had contained the library card was long gone, discarded after he'd removed anything useful. But its accidental gift had opened doors Marcus was only beginning to explore. In the city's vast network of public resources, he'd found the tools needed to begin his comeback. Now he needed to learn how to use them effectively. As he walked through the evening streets, past the restaurants and shops that represented a world he could no longer afford to enter, Marcus began to understand that his homelessness might actually be an advantage. Whitmore saw him as defeated, broken, no longer a threat worth monitoring. That invisibility would allow him to work undetected, gathering evidence and building capabilities while his enemy remained focused on other concerns. The library card, a random piece of plastic found in a discarded wallet, had become his first weapon in a war he was finally ready to fight. The pawn shop laptop sat on the counter like a wounded animal, its black plastic case scarred by years of rough handling, and its screen spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the fluorescent light. The price tag, $75, represented nearly 2 weeks of careful scavenging and the generous donation from a businessman who'd mistaken Marcus for a veteran. The machine was obsolete by Silicon Valley standards, but to Marcus it looked like salvation. "That thing's got more problems than a politician in an election year," said Jerry, the pawn shop owner, his massive frame squeezed behind a counter cluttered with electronics in various states of decay. "Hard drive's probably shot. Battery won't hold a charge for more than 20 minutes. And the keyboard's missing half its letters. But it boots up, mostly." Marcus ran his fingers along the laptop's damaged surface, feeling the raised edges where the plastic had cracked and been inexpertly repaired with electrical tape. The machine was a 5-year-old ThinkPad that had clearly seen heavy use in some corporate environment before being discarded for newer equipment. To most people, it was electronic junk. To Marcus, it was a gateway back to the digital world he'd been forced to abandon. "Does it have Wi-Fi capability?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear confirmation. "Yeah, built-in wireless. Connects fine to whatever networks are available. The screen's the biggest problem. You'll need to find the right angle to avoid the worst of the cracks. And don't expect to do anything too fancy. This baby's running Windows 7 and has maybe 4 gigs of RAM." 4 gigabytes of RAM. Marcus remembered when that had been considered generous for a development machine. Now it was barely enough to run a modern web browser effectively. But he wasn't planning to compete with current technology. He needed something that could run basic programming tools and connect to the internet without drawing attention. This broken-down laptop was perfect for his purposes. The transaction took most of his carefully hoarded cash, leaving Marcus with barely enough money for a week's worth of food. But as he walked out of the pawn shop with the laptop tucked under his arm, he felt richer than he had in months. The machine represented possibility, the first tangible step toward rebuilding his life on his own terms. His first challenge was finding a place to work. The library's computer time limits made serious programming impossible, but they did allow him to download essential software during his brief sessions. Coffee shops offered Wi-Fi and electrical outlets, but required periodic purchases to justify extended stays. 24-hour diners were more tolerant of lingering customers, especially during slow periods when extra bodies actually improved the atmosphere. Marcus settled into a routine that revolved around the city's rhythms of tolerance and enforcement. Early mornings at the Sunrise Diner on Van Ness, where the night shift waitress had grown accustomed to his presence and let him nurse a single cup of coffee for hours. Afternoons at various coffee shops, rotating locations to avoid overstaying. His welcome evenings back at the library, downloading documentation and tutorials to study later on his own machine. The laptop's limitations forced him to work smarter rather than harder. Without the luxury of multiple monitors and high-end development environments, he had to focus on essential functionality and elegant code architecture. The constraints that might have frustrated his former self actually sharpened his skills, teaching him to achieve maximum impact with minimal resources. His first project was deliberately modest, a simple web application that aggregated job postings from multiple sources and filtered them based on customizable criteria. Nothing revolutionary, but it demonstrated technical competency and provided a foundation for more ambitious development. Working on the damaged screen required constant adjustment of his viewing angle, but the inconvenience kept him alert and focused. "You're that guy, aren't you?" The voice belonged to David Martinez, a former contractor who had worked briefly at Technova during Marcus's tenure there. David sat down at the adjacent table in the Mission District coffee shop where Marcus had been coding for the past 3 hours, his expression a mixture of recognition and awkward sympathy. "David." Marcus closed the laptop partway, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance and circumstances. "Good to see you." "Man, I heard about what happened. The whole IP theft thing. That was brutal." David glanced around the coffee shop, perhaps wondering what Marcus was doing there with an obviously cheap laptop instead of working at some prestigious tech company. "It's been a challenging time," Marcus said carefully, "but I'm working on getting back into development, building some new projects." David's eyes lingered on the laptop with its cracked screen and electrical tape repairs. In Silicon Valley's culture of perpetual upgrades, working on such obsolete equipment was almost shameful, a visible sign of professional failure. "What are you working on?" David asked, his tone suggesting polite interest rather than genuine curiosity. Marcus had prepared for this question, knowing that his circumstances made honest explanation difficult. A job aggregation platform. Something to help developers find opportunities that match their specific skill sets and preferences. Sounds interesting. You looking for freelance work? I might know some people who need simple projects handled quickly. The offer was kindly meant, but it stung nonetheless. Simple projects. David was offering him the kind of basic coding work typically given to fresh bootcamp graduates or offshore contractors. The same man who had once sought Marcus's advice on complex algorithmic challenges now saw him as suitable only for elementary tasks. "I appreciate that," Marcus replied. "Right now I'm focused on building out my own platform, but I'll keep it in mind for the future." After David left, Marcus sat for a long time staring at his reflection in the laptop's black screen. The interaction had clarified something important about his situation. Even people who wished him well couldn't see past his current circumstances to the capabilities that remained unchanged. If he wanted to be taken seriously as a developer, again, he needed to create something that demanded respect regardless of the equipment used to build it. That realization led to his most important decision since acquiring the laptop. Instead of building safe, conventional applications that demonstrated basic competency, he would create something revolutionary, software so innovative and effective that it would force the tech community to acknowledge his abilities despite his circumstances. The idea had been percolating in his mind since his encounter with Whitmore outside Le Bernardin. Traditional job applications weren't working because his reputation had been systematically destroyed. But what if he could create an application so successful, so obviously valuable, that it generated its own momentum independent of his personal history? Marcus began sketching the architecture for what would become his comeback vehicle, a machine learning platform that could predict market trends with unprecedented accuracy by analyzing patterns in social media sentiment, news coverage, and economic indicators. The concept built on his original algorithm but extended it into new domains where the applications would be immediately obvious to investors and entrepreneurs. The technical challenges were immense, especially given his limited resources. Modern machine learning required significant computational power for training models, far beyond what his damaged laptop could provide. But Marcus had learned to think creatively about resource constraints during his months on the streets. Cloud computing services offered powerful virtual machines on a pay-per-use basis. Free tiers provided enough processing power for initial development and testing. More importantly, he had something most developers lacked: time and motivation. While his former colleagues balanced development work with meetings, office politics, and personal lives, Marcus could dedicate 18 hours a day to coding with an intensity born of desperation. His circumstances had stripped away every distraction, leaving only the pure focus of someone who understood that this project represented his only path back to respectability. The early prototype took shape over weeks of marathon coding sessions. Marcus worked with the methodical patience of someone who understood that every line of code had to be perfect the first time. He couldn't afford the luxury of iterative refinement that characterized typical development cycles. The damaged screen forced him to work in short bursts, giving his eyes time to recover while his mind processed the next phase of implementation. Sarah's promised support proved invaluable during this period. Their communication remained carefully limited. Encrypted emails sent from public computers to avoid any connection to her Technova employment. But her technical feedback helped Marcus refine his approach and avoid common pitfalls that could have cost him weeks of development time. "Your architectural choices are sound," she wrote in response to his design specifications. "But you're going to need better data sources if you want the kind of predictive accuracy that will get people's attention. The free APIS won't give you the granularity or reliability you need for serious market analysis." The data problem was real, but Marcus had anticipated it. His research into Whitmore's business practices had revealed that Meridian Technologies held premium subscriptions to several financial data services that would be perfect for his needs. If he could find a way to access that data without triggering security alerts, he could train his models using the same high-quality information that powered Meridian's own analysis tools. The solution came from an unexpected source: Robert, his homeless friend who had once designed aircraft navigation systems. During one of their conversations in the library's periodical section, Robert mentioned his ongoing access to various technical databases through his former employer's alumni network. "Most companies are terrible about revoking access when people leave," Robert explained, "especially for systems that aren't considered security critical. Academic databases, industry publications, research networks. Half my old credentials still work 3 years later." The observation sparked an idea that would prove crucial to Marcus's project. If Robert's experience was typical, then former employees of companies throughout Silicon Valley might still have access to resources their ex-employers assumed were secure. It was a vulnerability that could be exploited by someone patient enough to identify the right targets and careful enough to avoid detection. Marcus spent days in the library researching the employment histories of people who had worked at companies with access to premium financial data. LinkedIn profiles, corporate press releases, and industry publications provided a treasure trove of information about who had worked where and when. More importantly, they revealed patterns of employment that suggested which individuals might still have access to valuable resources. The first successful breach came through a former Meridian Technologies intern who had left the company 6 months earlier, but whose system access had never been properly terminated. Marcus discovered the vulnerability through careful social engineering, a friendly conversation about shared experiences in the tech industry that revealed the intern's continued ability to access certain company systems. I probably shouldn't still be able to log into their research database, the intern had mentioned during their coffee shop encounter. But nobody ever told me to stop, and sometimes I reference their market analysis for my freelance projects. That admission provided Marcus with exactly what he needed, a pathway to the high-quality data that would make his machine learning models competitive with anything the major firms could produce. More importantly, it confirmed his growing understanding that even well-funded companies like Meridian had security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with patience and technical skill. As his prototype evolved from concept to working software, Marcus began to see a path forward that went beyond simply rebuilding his career. The combination of innovative technology, superior data sources, and absolute dedication was creating something that could compete directly with established players in the market analysis space. His broken laptop and damaged screen were becoming the foundation for what might prove to be Whitmore's worst nightmare. A competitor who understood exactly how the game was played and had nothing left to lose. The machine that had cost him most of his remaining money was transforming into the most valuable tool he'd ever owned. And unlike his previous work at Technova, this time he would own every line of code, every algorithm, every insight. When the time came to reveal his creation to the world, there would be no question about who deserved credit for the innovation. Late at night, working by the dim light of the coffee shop's neon signs, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his termination. The quiet satisfaction of building something truly exceptional. The laptop's limitations had forced him to write cleaner, more efficient code than he'd ever produced in his comfortable corporate environment. The constraints that should have crippled his development process had instead refined it, creating software that was both revolutionary and elegantly simple. Whitmore had destroyed Marcus's old life, but he'd also inadvertently created something more dangerous, an enemy with nothing to lose, everything to prove. The cracked screen that forced Marcus to squint and adjust his viewing angle had become a lens through which he could see his path to redemption with perfect clarity. The business card had been improvised from a coffee shop napkin, written in careful black ink while Marcus waited for his potential investor to arrive. Marcus Chen, founder, Predictive Analytics Solutions, it read, followed by a Gmail address he'd created that morning. The makeshift nature of his materials felt appropriate. Everything about his new venture was being built from scraps and determination. Tom Bradley had been recommended by Elena, the former nurse who had taught Marcus the geography of survival during his early days on the streets. Tom's nephew worked in venture capital, she'd mentioned, and might be willing to listen to an interesting pitch over coffee. It wasn't exactly a warm introduction, but it represented Marcus's first opportunity to present his work to someone with actual investment authority. Marcus had chosen a Starbucks in the financial district for their meeting, calculating that the setting would feel familiar to someone accustomed to business discussions while remaining affordable for his limited budget. He'd spent his last $20 on a decent shirt from Goodwill and had used the YMCA shower facilities to ensure he looked presentable. The laptop, despite its obvious damage, would have to speak for itself. Tom Bradley arrived precisely on time, a compact man in his 50s with the careful alertness of someone who had learned to evaluate opportunities quickly. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already assessing Marcus with the practiced efficiency of a professional evaluator. Elena mentioned you had developed some kind of market prediction software, Tom said as they settled into a corner table. I have to be honest, that's a crowded field with a lot of well-funded players. What makes your approach different? Marcus had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but sitting across from an actual investor made the stakes feel suddenly real. His homeless status wasn't immediately obvious given his cleaned-up appearance, but the damaged laptop would certainly raise questions about his circumstances and resources. Traditional market analysis focuses on historical data and established indicators. Marcus began, opening the laptop and angling the screen to minimize the visibility of its cracks. My system integrates real-time sentiment analysis from social media with economic indicators and news sentiment to predict market movements before they become obvious to conventional analysis. He'd prepared a demonstration using publicly available data that wouldn't reveal his access to premium sources. The results were impressive enough. His prototype had correctly predicted several minor market fluctuations over the past month with accuracy rates that exceeded established forecasting tools. Tom leaned forward as Marcus walked through the interface, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine interest. These prediction accuracies are remarkable. How are you processing the sentiment data to generate these confidence intervals? The technical discussion that followed was the first normal professional conversation Marcus had experienced in months. Tom's questions were sharp and informed, probing the assumptions and methodologies that underpinned the software. More importantly, he seemed to be evaluating the technology on its merits, rather than making judgments about Marcus's personal circumstances. The core innovation is in the pattern recognition algorithms, Marcus explained, pulling up a visualization that showed how his system identified emerging trends in social media chatter. Instead of looking for explicit financial commentary, I'm analyzing the emotional undertones and behavioral patterns that precede market movements. Tom studied the data flows with the concentration of someone who understood both the technical complexity and commercial implications of what he was seeing. After 20 minutes of detailed questions, he sat back with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "This is sophisticated work," Tom said finally. "But I have to ask, what's your background?" This kind of algorithmic development usually requires significant resources and a team of specialized developers. Marcus had prepared for this question, crafting a version of his story that was truthful without being self-defeating. I spent several years at Technova Solutions developing machine learning algorithms before starting this venture. I've been working independently for the past year, focusing on this specific application. It wasn't technically a lie, though it omitted the crucial details of his termination and current circumstances. Tom nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, though Marcus caught him glancing again at the laptop's obviously damaged condition. "What kind of funding are you looking for?" Tom asked. Marcus had researched typical seed investment amounts, but his actual needs were more modest than most startups would request. "I'm looking for $50,000 to cover server costs, premium data subscriptions, and basic operational expenses while I scale the platform and build a customer base." The amount was conservative by Silicon Valley standards, barely enough to rent office space for a few months, let alone hire employees or fund serious marketing efforts. But Marcus had learned to think differently about resource requirements. He didn't need an office when coffee shops provided perfectly adequate workspace. He didn't need employees when he could code 18 hours a day with focused intensity. His only real expenses were data access and computing power. Tom pulled out a legitimate business card and wrote something on the back. "I'm not in a position to make investment decisions myself, but I know people who are. This is the contact information for Jessica Wang at Catalyst Ventures. Tell her I referred you and send her the demo you just showed me." The referral felt like a victory, but Marcus knew it was just the first step in a much longer process. Real investors would ask harder questions and conduct more thorough due diligence. They would want to verify his claims about the software's performance and understand the competitive landscape in detail. More challengingly, they would eventually discover his true circumstances. The venture capital world was small and interconnected. Someone would recognize his name from the Technova scandal or notice inconsistencies in his story. When that happened, he needed to be prepared with a compelling explanation that reframed his situation as an advantage rather than a liability. The meeting with Jessica Wang took place the following week in a glass-walled conference room that offered panoramic views of the San Francisco Bay. Catalyst Ventures occupied 3 floors of a premium office building in Soma, its reception area decorated with awards and photos, documenting successful investments in emerging technology companies. Jessica was younger than Tom, probably in her early 30s, with the confident bearing of someone who had learned to make million-dollar decisions based on incomplete information. She'd clearly done her homework, arriving with printed copies of Marcus's demo materials and a notebook filled with questions about his technology and business model. Tom's referral carried a lot of weight, she said, as they settled into the conference room. He doesn't often recommend opportunities unless he thinks they have genuine potential. But I have to say, your funding request is unusual. $50,000 isn't enough to build a serious technology company these days. Marcus had refined his pitch based on his experience with Tom, emphasizing the software's competitive advantages while positioning his modest resource requirements as evidence of efficiency rather than lack of ambition. I'm not trying to build a traditional technology company, he explained. My goal is to demonstrate market viability with minimal overhead, then scale based on proven demand rather than projected growth. The low burn rate means every dollar goes directly into capability development rather than administrative overhead. Jessica pulled up his demo on her laptop, working through the interface with the systematic thoroughness of someone evaluating a significant investment. Her questions were more sophisticated than Tom's, probing not just the technical implementation, but the business strategy and competitive positioning. Your prediction accuracy is impressive, she said, after reviewing several months of back-tested results. But accuracy is only valuable if you can monetize it effectively. Who's your target customer, and how do you plan to acquire them? Marcus had spent considerable time thinking about this challenge. His software was technically superior to many existing solutions, but he lacked the sales infrastructure and market relationships that established companies could leverage. His go-to-market strategy needed to be as innovative as his technology. I'm targeting smaller investment firms and independent traders who can't afford the premium services offered by established providers, he said. The same demographic that Tom represents, sophisticated enough to recognize superior performance, but price-sensitive enough to value our cost advantage. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from intellectual property protection to scalability challenges. Jessica's questions revealed both genuine interest and professional skepticism. She was clearly intrigued by the technology, but cautious about the unconventional circumstances surrounding its development. I'm going to need to do some due diligence on your background, she said as the meeting concluded. Standard procedure for any investment consideration. Can you provide references from your previous employment and documentation of your technical credentials? This was the moment Marcus had been dreading. Any serious investigation would reveal the circumstances of his departure from Technova and potentially derail the entire investment process. But refusing to provide references would be equally damaging to his credibility. Of course, he said, maintaining his composure despite the internal panic. I should mention that my departure from Technova was complicated by some intellectual property disputes that were ultimately resolved in my favor. I'm happy to discuss the details, but the situation involved some competitive intelligence issues that required confidential handling. Jessica's expression sharpened with interest rather than concern. In the venture capital world, competitive intelligence disputes often indicated valuable technology that multiple companies wanted to acquire. "That's actually encouraging," she said. "It suggests your work was valuable enough to fight over. Can you provide any documentation of the resolution?" Marcus realized he'd stumbled onto a narrative that could actually work in his favor. By reframing his termination as a competitive dispute that had been resolved, he could acknowledge the controversy while maintaining his credibility as an innovator. The resolution included non-disclosure provisions that limit what I can discuss publicly, he said carefully. "But I can say that I retain full rights to the core technologies that power my current platform." It wasn't exactly true, the legal battle had never reached a formal resolution, and his rights to any technology developed at Technova remained questionable. But it wasn't entirely false, either, since his current software was built from scratch using entirely new approaches. Jessica seemed satisfied with this explanation, making notes that suggested she was moving forward with the evaluation process, rather than backing away. "I'll need a few weeks to complete the due diligence and discuss the opportunity with my partners. Can you continue operating at your current level during that time frame?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied, though he had no idea how he would pay for food and shelter if the investment process dragged on much longer. His savings were exhausted, and his current lifestyle was sustainable only because he had eliminated every unnecessary expense. Walking out of Catalyst Ventures' gleaming offices, Marcus felt a mixture of hope and anxiety that had become familiar during his months of rebuilding. The meeting had gone better than he'd dared to expect, but he was now committed to a story that would require careful management. If Jessica's investigation uncovered inconvenient truths about his circumstances, more immediately, he needed to solve the practical problem of maintaining his facade of professional stability while living on the streets. Investors expected regular communication and consistent performance. Difficult to maintain when your office was a series of coffee shops and your bedroom was wherever you could find. Safe shelter. The solution came from an unexpected source. Robert, his homeless friend who had once designed aircraft navigation systems. During one of their evening conversations in the library, Robert mentioned his arrangement with a mail forwarding service that provided a business address for freelance work. $20 a month gets you a real address in a good neighborhood, Robert explained. They'll accept packages, hold mail, even take phone messages if you need them to. Looks completely legitimate to anyone checking your credentials. The mail forwarding service became the first piece of Marcus's elaborate construction of professional normalcy. A virtual office address in Soma made his business appear established and credible. A Google Voice number provided professional phone service without requiring an actual phone plan. Careful scheduling of meetings and communications created the impression of a busy entrepreneur managing a growing enterprise. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, Marcus remained acutely aware of how precarious his situation had become. He was essentially performing the role of a successful tech entrepreneur while living in circumstances that would horrify the investors he was courting. The gap between appearance and reality created constant stress, but it also motivated him to work with an intensity that his former comfortable circumstances had never demanded. Late at night, coding on his damaged laptop while other homeless individuals slept around him, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he'd been a successful developer with a comfortable apartment and promising career. Now he was a homeless entrepreneur building a revolutionary company from nothing but determination and technical skill. The contrast should have been depressing, but instead, Marcus found it oddly liberating. He'd learned that success could disappear overnight, but he'd also discovered that rebuilding was possible with nothing more than intelligence, persistence, and careful planning. The business card printed on a napkin had become the foundation for something that might eventually make Whitmore regret his casual cruelty outside La Bernardin. Whether that revenge would take the form of business competition or something more direct remained to be seen. But for the first time since his world collapsed, Marcus felt like he was playing offense rather than defense. The damaged laptop had become his weapon, and he was finally ready to use it. The newspaper clipping had been folded so many times that the creases threatened to separate the paper entirely, but the headline remained clearly visible. Meridian Technologies. Stock drops 15%, following quarterly earnings miss. Marcus smoothed the article carefully on the coffee shop table, studying the financial details that suggested his indirect strategy was beginning to take effect. The decline wasn't directly attributable to his efforts. Meridian's problems seemed to stem from increased competition in the data analytics space and higher than expected operational costs. But Marcus recognized patterns in the company's struggles that aligned with his own growing success. As his software gained traction among smaller investment firms, it was creating ripple effects that were beginning to impact the established players. 3 months had passed since his meeting with Jessica Wang, and the due diligence process had concluded with a $50,000 investment that transformed his circumstances almost overnight. The money had allowed him to rent a modest studio apartment in the Mission District, purchase legitimate business equipment, and most importantly, access the premium data feeds that made his software genuinely competitive with enterprise-level solutions. The transformation from homeless developer to funded entrepreneur had required careful orchestration of his public image. The mail forwarding service had provided a credible business address. The virtual office package included conference room access for investor meetings. Most crucially, his early customers were generating positive word of mouth that attracted additional clients without requiring expensive marketing campaigns. Your software correctly predicted the biotech sector volatility 3 weeks before it became obvious to the major firms, said Michael Torres, a portfolio manager at a mid-sized investment fund who had become one of Marcus's most enthusiastic clients. That's the kind of edge that can make or break quarterly performance. The conversation was taking place in the same Starbucks where Marcus had pitched Tom Bradley, but the context had changed dramatically. Instead of desperately seeking validation from a potential investor, he was now fielding requests from clients who wanted expanded access to his platform's capabilities. The prediction accuracy comes from analyzing sentiment patterns that traditional systems miss, Marcus explained, pulling up his latest performance metrics on a new laptop that actually functioned properly. Social media chatter contains emotional signals that precede market movements by days or sometimes weeks. Michael leaned forward, studying the data with the intensity of someone whose professional reputation depended on making correct investment decisions. I've seen other sentiment analysis tools, but nothing with this level of granularity. How are you processing the data to extract these predictive signals? The technical discussion that followed would have been impossible during Marcus's homeless period, when his damaged equipment and uncertain circumstances made professional credibility nearly impossible to maintain. Now, with proper tools and a stable working environment, he could focus entirely on developing and refining his technology, but success was bringing new challenges that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Word of his software's effectiveness was spreading through Silicon Valley's interconnected investment community, attracting attention from competitors who wanted to understand how a previously unknown developer had created such sophisticated technology. More concerning were the subtle inquiries about his background that suggested someone was conducting a more thorough investigation than Jessica's routine due diligence had required. Former Technova employees were being contacted by people who claimed to be considering Marcus for consulting opportunities, but whose questions seemed designed to uncover details about his departure from the company. Sarah had warned him about the increased scrutiny during one of their carefully encrypted email exchanges. "Someone's been asking questions about you around town," she'd written. Nothing directly threatening, but the inquiries are more systematic than casual curiosity would explain. You should assume that your past situation will become public knowledge. Eventually, the warning had prompted Marcus to accelerate his timeline for building credibility and market position. If Whitmore or his associates discovered Marcus's comeback before he was fully established, they might attempt to sabotage his new venture using the same tactics that had destroyed his career at Technova. The solution was to become too successful, too ignore, and too visible to attack quietly. Marcus began accepting speaking engagements at industry conferences, sharing insights about predictive analytics that demonstrated his expertise while building his reputation as an innovative thinker. The presentations were carefully crafted to showcase his technical capabilities without revealing the full scope of his competitive advantages. The key insight is that market sentiment isn't just about what people say, it's about how they say it. Marcus explained to an audience of quantitative analysts at a financial technology summit in downtown San Francisco. Emotional undertones in social media posts often contradict the explicit content, and those contradictions are predictive indicators for market volatility. The response was gratifying. Several audience members approached him afterward with questions about licensing his technology for their own applications. Business cards were exchanged, follow-up meetings scheduled, partnership opportunities discussed. For the first time since his termination from Technova, Marcus felt like he was being taken seriously as a technical innovator rather than dismissed as a Maya. Curiosity, but the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. A detailed analysis of his software published in the Journal of Financial Technology by researchers at Stanford, who had gained access to his platform through one of his academic licensing agreements. The paper described his approach as a breakthrough in real-time sentiment analysis with significant implications for quantitative trading strategies. The academic endorsement provided third-party credibility that no amount of marketing could have achieved. Within weeks of the paper's publication, Marcus was fielding inquiries from major investment banks and hedge funds that had previously been inaccessible to a startup with limited resources. "We're interested in licensing your technology for our institutional trading platform," said Rebecca Chen, a senior vice president at Goldman Sachs, who had reached out after reading the Stanford analysis. "The performance metrics your academic partners reported are consistent with our internal testing, and we see significant potential for integration with our existing infrastructure." The conversation took place in Goldman's San Francisco offices, a gleaming monument to financial success that would have intimidated Marcus during his homeless period. Now, equipped with the confidence that came from proven technical achievement, he was able to negotiate from a position of strength. "I'm open to licensing discussions," Marcus replied, "but I should mention that my technology is already generating significant value for current clients. Any partnership would need to recognize the platform's proven worth in the marketplace." It was a delicate balance between demonstrating confidence and avoiding arrogance. The major firms had resources that could either accelerate his growth or crush his independence, depending on how the relationships were structured. Marcus needed their validation and access to larger markets, but he also needed to maintain control over the technology that represented his only real competitive advantage. The negotiation process revealed how dramatically his circumstances had changed in just a few months. Instead of begging for opportunities, he was now evaluating multiple offers from organizations that had previously been unreachable. The homeless developer who had coded desperately on a broken laptop was becoming a successful entrepreneur whose technology was reshaping how investment decisions were made. But success was also creating new vulnerabilities. As his profile increased, the chances of discovery by Whitmore or his associates grew correspondingly. Marcus knew that his former tormentor would eventually learn about his comeback, and when that happened, the confrontation would be inevitable. The Realization prompted Marcus to begin gathering his own intelligence about Meridian Technologies and Whitmore's current activities. If his past was going to be exposed, he wanted to ensure that Whitmore's own questionable practices would receive equal scrutiny. The research revealed a pattern of aggressive acquisitions and intellectual property disputes that extended well beyond Marcus's own experience. Meridian had grown rapidly through a strategy of identifying innovative smaller companies, engaging in collaboration discussions, and then acquiring their technology through legal mechanisms that often left the original developers with little recourse. "The documentation you've compiled is remarkable," said Elena Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who specialized in corporate malfeasance and had agreed to review Marcus's findings. "If even half of these allegations are substantiated, you're describing a systematic pattern of intellectual property theft that has affected dozens of companies over several years." Elena's involvement represented a new phase in Marcus's long-term strategy. Instead of simply rebuilding his own career, he was beginning to position himself as an advocate for all of Whitmore's victims. The transformation from personal revenge to broader justice gave his efforts a moral authority that resonated with potential allies and supporters. "The challenge will be finding victims who are willing to go on the record," Elena continued. "Most of the settlement agreements include non-disclosure clauses that prevent public discussion. We'll need to find another way to document the pattern without violating existing legal agreements." The investigative process was painstaking, requiring careful verification of claims and extensive documentation of connections between apparently separate incidents. But Marcus's technical background proved invaluable for analyzing the digital evidence that revealed the scope of Meridian's operations. More importantly, the investigation was attracting the attention of other technology professionals who had their own concerns about Whitmore's business practices. An informal network was beginning to form, consisting of former employees, competitors, and industry observers who were willing to share information about suspicious activities they had witnessed or experienced. "The tide is definitely turning," Sarah observed during one of their periodic coffee meetings. "People are starting to talk about Meridian's practices more openly. Your success is making others feel like it's safe to speak up about what they've seen." The metaphor was appropriate. Marcus's individual comeback was becoming part of a larger wave of scrutiny that was beginning to impact Whitmore's ability to operate with impunity. The newspaper clipping about Meridian's declining stock price was just one indicator of mounting pressures that were affecting the company's performance and reputation. But Marcus knew that external pressure alone wouldn't be sufficient to achieve the justice he sought. Whitmore was too skilled at legal manipulation and too well-connected politically to be brought down by bad publicity or competitive pressure. Real accountability would require evidence of criminal behavior that couldn't be dismissed or settled. Quietly, that evidence was beginning to emerge from Marcus's careful analysis of Meridian's digital communications and business practices. The same technical skills that have made his predictive analytics software successful were revealing patterns in Whitmore's operations that suggested violations of federal laws governing corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. The investigation was dangerous. Whitmore had demonstrated his willingness to destroy lives to protect his interests, and Marcus was now presenting a direct threat to the empire built on systematic theft. But the homeless months had taught Marcus patience and careful planning that his former comfortable circumstances had never required. As he sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by whiteboards covered with network diagrams and evidence timelines, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. The newspaper clipping about Meridian's declining fortunes was just one piece of a larger puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete picture. 6 months ago, he had been broken and desperate, coding on a damaged laptop while struggling to survive on the streets. Now he was a successful entrepreneur whose technology was being courted by major financial institutions, and whose investigation into corporate malfeasance was beginning to attract serious attention from journalists and law enforcement. The transformation felt almost surreal, but Marcus understood that it was just the beginning. Whitmore had humiliated him outside Le Bernardin, expecting that a broken man would remain broken. Instead, he had created an enemy who combined technical brilliance with the focused determination that came from having nothing left to lose. The real confrontation was still ahead, but Marcus was no longer the naive developer who had trusted in fairness and merit. He had become something more dangerous, someone who understood how the game was really played and had learned to play it better than his opponents. The newspaper clipping was evidence that his patient strategy was working, but it was only the first crack in the foundation of Whitmore's carefully constructed empire of theft and manipulation. The USB drive was smaller than Marcus's thumb, an innocuous piece of black plastic that contained enough evidence to destroy Jonathan Whitmore's empire and potentially send him to federal prison. It had arrived in Marcus's mailbox without explanation, accompanied only by a note written in Sarah's careful handwriting. Found this in an old backup drive. Thought you might find it interesting. Marcus stared at the device for a long moment before inserting it into his laptop, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation and apprehension. Sarah's message had been deliberately vague, but her tone suggested that whatever the drive contained would change everything about his investigation into Meridian Technologies. The contents exceeded his wildest expectations. The drive held hundreds of encrypted files, email communications, financial records, strategic planning documents, and recorded phone conversations that painted a comprehensive picture of Whitmore's criminal enterprise. But more importantly, they revealed that Marcus's case was just one small piece of a much larger conspiracy that involved corporate espionage on an international scale. The first file Marcus opened was a planning document titled Project Acquisition Protocol that outlined Meridian's systematic approach to identifying and stealing intellectual property from smaller technology companies. The methodology was chillingly thorough. Target identification based on patent filings and technical publications, intelligence gathering through fake collaboration discussions, evidence fabrication to justify legal action, and finally, acquisition of the technology through settlements that included comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Phase 1. Target Assessment. The document read: identify companies with valuable IP that lack resources for extended legal defense. Focus on innovative algorithms, proprietary datasets, and breakthrough methodologies that can be integrated into existing Meridian platforms. Marcus recognized his own situation in the clinical language of corporate predation. Technova had been selected because his algorithm represented exactly the kind of breakthrough technology that Meridian needed to maintain its competitive advantage. The collaboration meeting where he'd first encountered Whitmore hadn't been a legitimate business discussion. It had been an intelligence gathering operation designed to assess the value of his work and identify vulnerabilities in Technova's security. But his case was far from unique. The drive contained evidence of similar operations targeting dozens of companies across the United States and Europe. The scope was staggering. Meridian had systematically looted the intellectual property of small innovators for over a decade, building its technology portfolio through theft rather than legitimate development. The financial projections are remarkable, Marcus muttered to himself as he reviewed spreadsheets that quantified the value of stolen technology. They've acquired over $200 million worth of intellectual property while spending less than $50 million on legal fees and settlements. The economic efficiency of Whitmore's approach was disgusting in its calculated ruthlessness. By targeting companies that couldn't afford extended legal battles, Meridian could acquire valuable technology for a fraction of its development cost while destroying the careers of the people who had created it. More disturbing were the files that revealed the international scope of the conspiracy. Meridian had partnerships with technology companies in China and Russia that provided access to foreign markets while sharing intelligence about American innovations. The arrangement appeared to violate multiple federal laws governing technology, transfer, and national security. Project Snowfall. One file was labeled, containing communications between Whitmore and executives at a Beijing-based technology firm. The messages discussed sharing advanced machine learning algorithms that have been acquired from American startups, including detailed technical specifications that could give foreign competitors significant advantages in emerging markets. Marcus realized he was looking at evidence of not just corporate theft, but potential treason. Whitmore had been selling American technological innovations to foreign companies that were likely connected to intelligence services. The implications went far beyond individual cases of intellectual property theft. This was systematic technology transfer that could impact national security. The recorded phone conversations provided even more damning evidence. Marcus listened with growing horror as Whitmore discussed strategies for neutralizing developers who posed threats to Meridian's operations. The language was careful, avoiding explicit threats, but the intent was clear. People who refused to cooperate or who attempted to expose Meridian's practices would face comprehensive destruction of their careers and reputations. The Chen situation demonstrates the effectiveness of our reputation management protocols, Whitmore's voice said in one recording. Complete professional isolation, financial ruin, and social ostracism. Very difficult to recover from that level of systematic damage. Hearing his own destruction discussed in such clinical terms was deeply unsettling, but it also provided crucial evidence of Whitmore's personal involvement in criminal activities. The recordings captured him acknowledging and celebrating the illegal tactics used to acquire intellectual property and eliminate threats, but the most shocking revelation came from files that revealed the extent to which Meridian had corrupted the legal and regulatory systems that were supposed to protect innovators. The company maintained relationships with law firms, patent examiners, and even federal prosecutors that created a web of influence designed to ensure favorable outcomes in intellectual property disputes. Judge Morrison's ruling in the Innovative Solutions case creates valuable precedent for future acquisition targets. One email read, "The financial considerations we discussed have been transferred to the specified account." Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. Whitmore wasn't just stealing technology. He was bribing judges and prosecutors to ensure that his victims had no legal recourse. The corruption extended deep into the justice system, creating a network of compromised officials who would support Meridian's interests regardless of legal merit. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also presented Marcus with a profound dilemma. The information on the USB drive could destroy Whitmore and potentially expose an international conspiracy that threatened American technological leadership. But using it would require cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies that might themselves be compromised by Meridian's influence. More immediately, possessing the evidence put Marcus in considerable danger. If Whitmore discovered that his communications had been compromised, he would undoubtedly take extreme measures to protect himself and his operation. The recordings made clear that he viewed threats to his business as existential challenges that justified any response. Marcus spent hours reviewing the files, cross-referencing names and dates to build a comprehensive understanding of Meridian's operations. The pattern that emerged was more sophisticated and extensive than he had imagined possible. Whitmore hadn't just built a successful company. He had created a criminal enterprise that operated with the efficiency and ruthlessness of organized crime. "Sarah, we need to talk," Marcus wrote in an encrypted message. "The information you provided changes everything. This is much bigger than either of us realized." A response came within minutes. "I know. That's why I gave it to you. I couldn't sit on this anymore, knowing what he's done to you and so many others. But Marcus, you need to be careful. If he finds out about the files, both of our lives could be in danger." The warning was sobering but not surprising. Marcus had already begun implementing security measures that reflected his understanding of the escalated threat level. His apartment now had multiple locks and a security system. He varied his daily routines to avoid predictable patterns. Most importantly, he had created multiple backup copies of the evidence and stored them in secure locations where they could be accessed by trusted allies if something happened to him. But the evidence also provided Marcus with an opportunity he had never imagined possible. Instead of seeking personal revenge against Whitmore, he could now position himself as the key witness in a federal investigation that could dismantle an entire criminal network. The transformation from victim to whistleblower would provide him with legal protections while serving the broader cause of justice. The decision to contact federal law enforcement was difficult, given the evidence of corruption within the system. But Marcus realized that the scope of Whitmore's crimes, particularly the international technology transfer allegations, would attract the attention of agencies that operated above the level where local corruption could be effective. "Agent Rodriguez, FBI Cybercrimes Division," the woman said when she answered Marcus's carefully placed call. "How can I help you?" "I have evidence of systematic intellectual property theft and possible technology transfer violations involving a company called Meridian Technologies," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "The evidence includes recorded communications, financial records, and documentation of bribes paid to judicial officials." The silence that followed was pregnant with significance. Marcus could almost hear Agent Rodriguez's mental gears turning as she processed the implications of his claims. "Sir, these are very serious allegations," she said finally. "I'm going to need you to come in for a formal interview so we can evaluate your evidence and determine appropriate next steps. Can you be at our San Francisco field office tomorrow morning?" Marcus agreed to the meeting, understanding that he was crossing a point of no return. By involving federal law enforcement, he was escalating the conflict with Whitmore to a level where compromise or negotiation would be impossible. One of them would emerge victorious, and the other would face complete destruction. As he prepared copies of the most critical files for his meeting with Agent Rodriguez, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a naive developer who believed that talent and hard work would be rewarded fairly. The homeless months had burned away that innocence, replacing it with a harder understanding of how the world actually operated. Now, armed with evidence that could expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the technology industry, Marcus was finally ready to fight back with weapons that matched his opponent's ruthlessness. The USB drive that Sarah had provided wasn't just evidence. It was the key to justice for dozens of victims who had been silenced by Meridian's systematic abuse of the legal system. Whitmore had made a critical error in preserving such detailed records of his criminal activities. His arrogance and desire for control had led him to document every aspect of his operations, creating a comprehensive case file that prosecutors would find irresistible. The humiliation outside Le Bernardin had been intended to break Marcus's spirit and ensure his permanent silence. Instead, it had created an enemy who combined technical brilliance with the focused determination that came from having nothing left to lose. Now, with evidence that could destroy Whitmore's empire, Marcus was ready to show his former tormentor the true cost of his casual cruelty. The real war was about to begin. But for the first time since his termination from Technova, Marcus felt confident about the outcome. Justice had been delayed, but it would not be denied. The USB drive in his hand contained the power to make Whitmore pay for every life he had destroyed in service of his greed and ambition. The invitation to the global tech Innovation Summit arrived on cream-colored cardstock that felt substantial. Between Marcus's fingers, its embossed lettering announcing an event that would bring together the most influential figures in Silicon Valley's technology ecosystem. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would never have received such an invitation. The summit was reserved for industry leaders, major investors, and established entrepreneurs whose companies were reshaping the digital landscape. But circumstances were no longer normal. Marcus's predictive analytics platform had gained enough recognition to warrant inclusion among the summit's featured innovators, and his growing reputation as a breakthrough developer had earned him a speaking slot on the artificial intelligence panel. More importantly, the guest list included Jonathan Whitmore, who would be presenting Meridian Technologies' latest acquisitions to potential investors and partners. "This is it," Marcus said quietly, studying the invitation while Sarah reviewed the final preparations they had made for what they both understood would be their last chance to expose Whitmore's criminal enterprise. He'll be there, probably feeling completely secure and confident. He has no idea what's coming. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity as Marcus and Sarah coordinated with FBI agent Rodriguez to build an airtight case against Whitmore and his network of co-conspirators. The evidence from the USB drive had prompted the Bureau to launch a full-scale investigation into Meridian Technologies, but they needed additional documentation to ensure successful prosecution of the most serious charges. Marcus's role had evolved from victim seeking justice to undercover asset, helping federal investigators gather real-time evidence of ongoing criminal activities. The transformation required him to maintain his public persona as a successful entrepreneur while secretly recording conversations and documenting interactions that could provide crucial testimony in eventual court proceedings. "The wire is completely undetectable," Agent Rodriguez had assured him during their final briefing session. "State-of-the-art technology that looks like a standard fitness tracker. Just remember to stay close enough to pick up clear audio, and don't do anything that might put yourself in physical danger." The warning was sobering but necessary. Marcus's investigation had revealed that Whitmore's organization was willing to use intimidation and violence to protect their interests. 2 former employees who had attempted to expose Meridian's practices had suffered suspicious accidents that left them unable to testify about what they had witnessed. But Marcus felt ready for whatever confrontation lay ahead. The months of rebuilding his life from nothing had given him a confidence and determination that his former, comfortable circumstances had never required. He was no longer the naive developer who had trusted in fairness and merit. He had become someone who understood how to fight back against systematic corruption and abuse. The summit would take place at the Moscone Center, a massive convention facility in downtown San Francisco that regularly hosted the technology industry's most important gatherings. Marcus had visited the venue before as an attendee at various conferences, but this time he would be presenting his own work to an audience. That included potential investors, business partners, and at least one federal criminal whose empire was about to collapse. "Your presentation needs to be completely normal," Agent Rodriguez had emphasized. "Nothing that would suggest you have any special knowledge or agenda beyond promoting your technology platform. The goal is to get Whitmore to approach you after the session, either to congratulate you on your success or to probe your knowledge of his activities." The irony was delicious. Whitmore would be walking into a trap, baited with the very success that his own cruelty had motivated Marcus to achieve. The humiliation outside Le Bernardin had been intended to break Marcus's spirit permanently. Instead, it had forged him into someone capable of building a technology company from nothing, and then using that success as a weapon against his tormentor. Marcus's presentation was scheduled for the second day of the summit, giving him time to observe Whitmore's behavior and identify opportunities for meaningful interaction. The agenda showed that Whitmore would be speaking about strategic acquisition methodologies in emerging technology markets, a topic that would allow him to boast about his systematic theft of intellectual property while presenting it as legitimate business strategy. He's going to be in his element, Sarah observed as they reviewed the summit schedule over coffee in Marcus's apartment, surrounded by people who admire his success and have no idea how he actually achieved it. His arrogance will be at its peak. Sarah's involvement in the investigation had required considerable courage, given her continued employment at Technova, and the risk of retaliation if Whitmore discovered her cooperation with federal authorities. But her insider knowledge of the technology industry and personal witness to Marcus's original persecution had made her testimony invaluable to the FBI's case. "I keep thinking about that day when they fired you," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have fought harder to defend you, should have questioned the evidence more aggressively. If I had spoken up then, maybe we could have prevented all the other victims who came after." Marcus reached across the table to squeeze her hand gently. "You couldn't have known what we were dealing with." Whitmore's operation was too sophisticated for anyone to recognize without the complete picture. The important thing is that we're stopping him now, before he can destroy any more lives. The preparation for the summit had required Marcus to perfect his public persona as a successful entrepreneur who had overcome early career setbacks to build an innovative technology company. The story wasn't entirely false. He genuinely had created breakthrough software that was revolutionizing how investment decisions were made. But it omitted the crucial details of his homelessness and the systematic investigation that had revealed Whitmore's criminal network. "The key is confidence without arrogance," Marcus rehearsed, practicing the presentation he would deliver to the summit's artificial intelligence panel. "I need to demonstrate technical competence and business success, while remaining approachable enough that Whitmore might feel comfortable engaging with me." The presentation itself was genuinely impressive, showcasing capabilities that would have been impossible without the insights Marcus had gained during his months of desperation and rebuilding. His software's predictive accuracy had improved dramatically as he incorporated lessons learned from his own experience of systematic persecution and survival. Traditional market analysis focuses on obvious indicators, Marcus practiced saying to an imaginary audience. But the most valuable insights come from understanding the emotional undercurrents that drive human behavior in stressful situations. My platform identifies these patterns before they become visible to conventional analysis. The subtle reference to his own experience would be lost on most listeners, but Marcus found satisfaction in the knowledge that his greatest innovation had emerged directly from the trauma Whitmore had inflicted. The homeless months had taught him to recognize patterns of vulnerability and exploitation that he never would have understood from his former position of privilege and security. Agent Rodriguez had arranged for additional federal agents to attend the summit as apparent technology investors and entrepreneurs, providing backup surveillance and protection without creating obvious law enforcement presence. The operation was carefully designed to appear like a normal business conference while actually functioning as an elaborate sting operation. "Remember, our primary goal is gathering evidence of ongoing criminal activities," Rodriguez had reminded Marcus during their final strategy session. "Whitmore's organization is still active, still targeting new victims. If we can record him discussing current operations, it will strengthen our case significantly." The anticipation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Marcus had spent months building toward this confrontation, but the stakes felt almost overwhelming. Success would mean justice for dozens of victims and the dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Failure could mean not just his own destruction, but the escape of criminals who would certainly become more careful about covering their tracks. "I keep thinking about that moment outside the restaurant," Marcus confided to Sarah as they made final preparations. when he dropped that $20 bill and told me to clean his shoes. He was so confident, so certain that I would always be beneath him. Tomorrow, I get to show him how wrong he was. The transformation from that desperate moment to his current position still felt surreal. Marcus had gone from homeless and broken to successful entrepreneur and federal witness in less than a year. The journey had required sacrifices and compromises. That had fundamentally changed his understanding of justice and morality. But it had also revealed reserves of strength and determination that Marcus hadn't known he possessed. The naive developer who had trusted in fairness and merit was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real justice sometimes required taking extraordinary risks and making personal sacrifices. As Marcus prepared for sleep on the night before the summit, he reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by Whitmore's casual cruelty. The humiliation that was intended to ensure his permanent silence had instead created an enemy with the patience, intelligence, and motivation necessary to bring down an entire criminal network. Tomorrow would determine whether that transformation was complete. The invitation to the Global Tech Innovation Summit represented more than just professional recognition. It was Marcus's opportunity to face his tormentor from a position of strength and reveal the true cost of systematic abuse and exploitation. Whitmore expected to encounter a broken man who had been permanently silenced by his campaign of destruction. Instead, he would meet someone who had learned to fight back with weapons that matched his own sophistication and ruthlessness. The homeless months had been a crucible that burned away Marcus's naive faith in the system, but they had also forged him into someone capable of achieving justice through his own efforts. The summit would be the culmination of everything Marcus had learned and built since that humiliating encounter outside Le Bernardin. Win or lose, it would be his chance to prove that victims of systematic abuse could fight back successfully if they were willing to be patient, careful, and utterly determined. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus's last conscious thought was of the invitation lying on his nightstand, cream-colored cardstock that represented his ticket to either vindication or destruction. Tomorrow would reveal which outcome his year of preparation had made possible. The presentation slide titled "The Cost of Stolen Dreams" filled the massive screen behind Marcus as he stood at the podium in Moscone Center's main auditorium, his voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated sound system to an audience of over 1,000 technology industry leaders. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him. He was using the same venue where Whitmore had announced several of his strategic acquisitions to reveal the criminal methods behind those supposed business successes. Traditional market analysis tells us what has happened, Marcus said, advancing to a slide that showed his software's prediction accuracy rates. But true innovation comes from understanding what will happen before conventional indicators make it obvious. That's the difference between following trends and creating them. The audience was engaged, leaning forward in their seats as Marcus demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything currently available in the market. But his real focus was on one particular figure in the third row, Jonathan Whitmore, who sat with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he was attending a routine industry presentation rather than witnessing the beginning of his own destruction. Whitmore looked exactly as Marcus remembered from their encounter outside Le Bernardin, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He was taking notes on a tablet, apparently impressed by Marcus's technical achievements, and unaware that every word was being recorded by federal surveillance equipment. The key insight, Marcus continued, is that market sentiment isn't just about financial metrics. It's about human psychology, about understanding how people react when they discover that institutions they trusted have betrayed them. The statement was carefully crafted to hint at deeper meanings while remaining appropriate for a technology conference. Marcus watched Whitmore's reaction carefully, looking for any sign that his former tormentor might be beginning to suspect. The true purpose of the presentation. Agent Rodriguez sat 4 rows behind Whitmore, posing as a venture capital analyst and monitoring the wireless surveillance equipment that was capturing everything happening in the auditorium. Their presence provided reassurance, but Marcus understood that the crucial moments of the operation would depend entirely on his own performance and ability to draw Whitmore into a conversation that would provide evidence of ongoing criminal activities. Questions? Marcus asked as he concluded the formal presentation portion of his talk. Several hands shot up immediately, but Marcus was gratified to see that Whitmore's was among them. The CEO's confidence remained intact, suggesting he saw Marcus as just another innovative developer whose technology might be worth acquiring through his proven methods of systematic theft and character assassination. Jonathan Whitmore, Meridian Technologies. Whitmore said when Marcus called on him, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Impressive work. Your prediction accuracy rates suggest access to data sources that go beyond publicly available information. How do you ensure the integrity and legality of your data acquisition methods? The question was loaded with implication, probing whether Marcus might be vulnerable to the same accusations of improper data access that Whitmore had used to destroy his reputation at Technova. It revealed the CEO's continuing arrogance even. While sitting in an auditorium surrounded by federal agents, he was already planning his next corporate predation campaign. Data integrity is paramount, Marcus replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while feeling a surge of satisfaction at Whitmore's unwitting self-incrimination. I've learned from observing situations where accusations of improper access were used to discredit innovative developers. My platform relies entirely on legitimately licensed data sources and transparent analytical methodologies. The reference to false accusations was subtle but deliberate, designed to plant seeds of recognition in Whitmore's mind without triggering immediate alarm. Marcus wanted his former tormentor to remember their previous encounter, but not until it was too late to escape the consequences. Of course, Whitmore responded smoothly. Due diligence in data sourcing is essential for maintaining credibility. Perhaps we could discuss potential collaboration opportunities? Meridian is always interested in partnerships with innovative developers. The offer was delivered with the same polished charm that Whitmore had used to lure Marcus into his original trap, but this time, Marcus was prepared for the predator's approach and ready to turn the conversation into evidence of criminal intent. I'd be honored to discuss collaboration, Marcus said, his voice betraying none of the anticipation he felt. Perhaps we could continue this conversation after the session. As the presentation concluded and audience members began filing out of the auditorium, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had accompanied every major turning point in his journey back from destruction. This was the moment he had been building toward for nearly a year, the opportunity to face Whitmore from a position of strength and document his admission of the crimes that had destroyed so many lives. Whitmore approached the stage with the confident stride of a successful executive, apparently pleased to have identified another potential target for his acquisition methodology. His smile was warm and professional, carefully calculated to establish rapport with a developer whose technology represented significant value to his organization. Marcus Chen, Whitmore said, extending his hand with the same false warmth he had displayed during their first meeting at Technova. Truly impressive presentation. I believe we met briefly a few years ago during some discussions with Technova Solutions. The moment of recognition Marcus had been waiting for finally arrived. Whitmore's expression shifted subtly as he processed the name and face, connecting them to his previous victim. But instead of alarm, Marcus saw calculation. Whitmore was evaluating whether his former target might now represent an opportunity or threat. "Yes, we did meet," Marcus replied, accepting the handshake while feeling the wire device Agent Rodriguez had given him, capturing every word of their conversation. "That was an interesting period in my career. I learned quite a lot about how the technology industry really operates." Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the implications of Marcus's statement. The presence of other conference attendees nearby limited what could be said openly, but the CEO's body language suggested growing awareness that this encounter was not the coincidence it appeared to be. "I hope the transition to independent development has been productive," Whitmore said carefully. "The technology sector can be challenging for entrepreneurs, especially those without extensive business networks." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Whitmore was reminding Marcus of his previous isolation and destruction while hinting that similar consequences could follow if he proved uncooperative. But the CEO's confidence remained intact, suggesting he still saw Marcus as manageable rather than dangerous. "It's been educational," Marcus replied. "I've discovered that success often comes from understanding patterns that others miss. For example, recognizing when apparently separate business failures are actually part of systematic campaigns." This time, Whitmore's reaction was more pronounced. His smile became fixed and artificial as he began to understand that Marcus might represent a more serious threat than anticipated. The casual mention of systematic campaigns suggested knowledge that went beyond personal experience. "Interesting perspective," Whitmore said, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more appropriate. I have a private conference room reserved upstairs." The invitation was exactly what Agent Rodriguez had hoped would happen, an opportunity for Marcus to engage Whitmore in extended conversation while recording devices captured evidence of criminal admissions. But it also represented the moment of greatest danger, when Marcus would be alone with someone who had demonstrated willingness to use extreme measures to protect his interests. "That sounds perfect," Marcus agreed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I think you'll find my insights about industry patterns quite illuminating." As they walked toward the elevator that would take them to Whitmore's private conference room, Marcus reflected on the strange symmetry of the moment. A year ago, he had been a homeless outcast whose life had been systematically destroyed by the man now walking beside him. The transformation from victim to federal witness represented a journey that had required sacrifices and compromises he could never have imagined. But it had also revealed the power of patient determination combined with superior intelligence and careful planning. Whitmore had created an enemy with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Now, walking into what the CEO believed was another opportunity for manipulation and control. He was actually entering a trap that would expose his criminal enterprise and provide justice for dozens of victims. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, carrying Marcus toward what would either be his vindication or his destruction. Either way, the homeless months that had begun with humiliation outside Le Bernardin were about to reach their conclusion in a confrontation that would determine whether systematic corporate predation could ultimately be defeated by its own victims. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Jonathan. Whitmore's wrists was barely audible over the commotion in the Moscone Center's executive conference room. But to Marcus, it rang out like a bell announcing the end of a long nightmare. FBI Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with her badge displayed prominently, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement as she read Whitmore his rights. "Jonathan Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft, bribery of federal officials, and violations of the Economic Espionage Act," Rodriguez announced while two additional agents secured the conference room and began collecting evidence from Whitmore's briefcase and electronic devices. The moment felt surreal to Marcus. who stood watching from the corner of the room where he had positioned himself when the FBI agents revealed themselves. After months of careful planning and preparation, the confrontation that would determine his future had concluded in less than 30 minutes of recorded conversation, during which Whitmore had comprehensively incriminated himself and his entire organization. "This is preposterous," Whitmore sputtered, his professional composure finally cracking as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his shock. "I demand to speak with my attorney immediately. This is clearly some kind of setup designed to damage my company's reputation." Agent Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Marcus that conveyed both satisfaction and professional acknowledgement of a job well done. The wire device Marcus had worn during his conversation with Whitmore had captured detailed admissions of criminal activities that went far beyond what prosecutors had dared to hope for. "Your attorney will be contacted," Rodriguez assured Whitmore, as the agents prepared to escort him from the building. "In the meantime, I suggest you consider the value of cooperation. The evidence against you and your organization is substantial, and your recorded statements from this afternoon have eliminated most of your legal defenses." The recording had been devastating. Whitmore's arrogance and desire to intimidate Marcus had led him to describe in explicit detail how Meridian Technologies had systematically targeted innovative companies for intellectual property theft. More damaging still were his admissions about bribing federal officials and sharing stolen American technology with foreign entities. "You really thought you could threaten me again," Marcus said, as the agents prepared to remove Whitmore from the conference room. "Just like you did outside Le Bernardin when you told me to clean your shoes for scraps. You never imagined that Broken Man would become capable of bringing down your entire criminal enterprise." Whitmore's eyes widened with recognition and rage as he finally understood the full scope of the trap he had walked into. The homeless developer he had humiliated for entertainment had not only rebuilt his life, but had become the key witness in a federal investigation that would destroy everything Whitmore had built through theft and corruption. "You have no idea what you've done," Whitmore said, his voice filled with venom as the agents began escorting him toward the door. "The people I work with don't tolerate betrayal. Your little victory today will cost you everything you think you've achieved." The threat was exactly what Agent Rodriguez had warned Marcus to expect. Whitmore's organization would likely attempt retaliation against witnesses who cooperated with federal authorities. But Marcus felt no fear, only satisfaction at seeing his tormentor finally face consequences for the systematic destruction of innocent lives. "The only thing I've done is expose a criminal who thought he was above the law," Marcus replied calmly. "Your threats don't frighten me anymore, Whitmore. I've already lost everything once and learned that I could survive it. You're the one who has everything to lose now." As the FBI agents led Whitmore away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice finally being served. The homeless months had been a crucible that burned away his naive faith in institutional fairness, but they had also forged him into someone capable of fighting back against systematic abuse with patience, intelligence, and determination. "Outstanding work," Agent Rodriguez said as she returned to collect the recording equipment and finalize the evidence collection. "His admissions today will make prosecution straightforward, and the evidence you helped us gather over the past month has identified dozens of additional victims and co-conspirators." The scope of the investigation had expanded dramatically since Marcus first contacted the FBI with evidence from Sarah's USB drive. Whitmore's criminal network included compromised officials in multiple federal agencies, international technology, transfer violations that threatened national security, and systematic theft of intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Arraignment tomorrow, then a lengthy legal process that will likely result in significant prison sentences for Whitmore and his key associates, Rodriguez explained. "Your testimony will be crucial. but the recorded evidence is so comprehensive that plea negotiations are almost inevitable. Marcus nodded, understanding that his role as a federal witness would require ongoing cooperation with prosecutors, building cases against an entire criminal network. But the burden felt manageable compared to the weight of injustice he had carried since his termination from Technova. "There's something else you should know," Rodriguez continued. "The investigation has revealed evidence that Whitmore's organization was planning to target your current company. You were never safe as long as he remained free to operate." The revelation was both sobering and validating. Marcus's decision to fight back hadn't just been about personal vindication. It had been necessary for his own survival. Whitmore's predatory nature meant that successful victims like Marcus would always represent threats that needed to be eliminated. As Marcus prepared to leave the conference room where his year-long journey from victim to federal witness had reached its climax, he reflected on the profound transformation that Whitmore's cruelty had inadvertently triggered. The homeless months had stripped away every comfort and assumption that had defined his previous life, but they had also revealed capabilities and determination he never would have discovered otherwise. Sarah was waiting in the hotel lobby when Marcus emerged from the conference area, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration as she processed what had just occurred. Her courage in providing the initial evidence and maintaining cooperation throughout the investigation had been crucial to achieving this outcome. "Is it really over?" she asked, studying Marcus's face for signs of the emotional impact she knew this moment must represent. "The legal process is just beginning," Marcus replied. "But yes, it's over. Whitmore's criminal enterprise has been exposed, and dozens of victims will finally have justice. The homeless man he tried to humiliate into permanent silence just brought down his entire empire." As they walked out of the Moscone Center into the late afternoon San Francisco sunshine, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his termination from Technova: genuine optimism about the future. His predictive analytics platform had achieved a success he dreamed of. Federal prosecutors had the evidence needed to dismantle a criminal network, and most importantly, other victims of systematic corporate predation would know that fighting back was possible. The handcuffs around Whitmore's wrists had represented more than just one man's arrest. They were proof that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be defeated by victims who refused to remain silent and were willing to dedicate themselves completely to the pursuit of justice. Standing on the sidewalk were barely. A year ago, he might have been just another homeless person ignored by the successful executives streaming past. Marcus Chen had become something his former tormentor never could have imagined: a champion of justice whose greatest triumph was built on the foundation of his deepest humiliation. The sound of those handcuffs would echo in his memory forever, but not as a symbol of his own destruction, rather as proof that patience, intelligence, and determination could ultimately triumph over even the most ruthless abuse of power. The new company logo was still drawn on the same coffee shop napkin that Tom Bradley had given Marcus during their first meeting, but now it was framed and hanging on the wall of his corner office in a gleaming downtown San Francisco high-rise. The simple sketch had become the symbol of Predictive Analytics Solutions, a company that had grown from desperate coding sessions on a broken laptop to a 50-employee firm that was reshaping how investment decisions were made across the financial industry. 6 months had passed since Jonathan Whitmore's arrest at the Global Tech Innovation Summit, and the legal proceedings were unfolding exactly as Agent Rodriguez had predicted. Whitmore had been denied bail due to flight risk and was awaiting trial on federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. More importantly, the investigation had exposed a criminal network that spanned multiple countries and industries, leading to dozens of additional arrests and the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen intellectual property. The Department of Justice wants to schedule another deposition next week, Sarah said as she entered Marcus's office with a folder of legal documents that required his review and signature. As Chief Technology Officer of Predictive Analytics Solutions, she had become his closest collaborator in both the business and legal aspects of their remarkable journey from corporate persecution to entrepreneurial success. "That's fine," Marcus replied, looking up from the financial projections that showed his company was on track to achieve $50 million in revenue within the next 12 months. "The more thoroughly we document Whitmore's crimes, the better. The chances that other victims will get justice." The legal process had been emotionally demanding, but ultimately cathartic. Marcus's testimony had helped prosecutors understand the full scope of Meridian Technologies' criminal operations, while his experience as a victim had provided crucial insights into how the organization identified and targeted innovative developers for systematic destruction. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings was learning about the other victims, who were finally receiving vindication and compensation for their losses. The small technology companies that had been destroyed by Whitmore's predatory practices were being compensated from assets seized during the federal investigation, while the developers whose careers had been ruined were having their reputations officially cleared through court findings. "Elena called this morning," Sarah continued, referring to the investigative journalist whose reporting had helped expose the broader pattern of corporate malfeasance that Whitmore's arrest had revealed. "The Washington Post wants to do a feature story about corporate whistleblowing and the role technology victims can play in exposing systematic abuse." The media attention had been intense but generally positive, with Marcus being portrayed as an example of how individual determination could triumph over institutional corruption. The narrative of a homeless developer who rebuilt his life and then brought down his tormentors resonated with audiences who had their own experiences of feeling powerless against wealthy and well-connected adversaries. More importantly, the publicity had attracted the attention of other victims of corporate predation who had previously felt too isolated and resource-constrained to fight back against their oppressors. Marcus's success had demonstrated that systematic abuse could be defeated through patient planning, technical competence, and willingness to accept personal risk in service of broader justice. "The best part isn't the media coverage," Marcus reflected, as he walked to his office window and looked down at the street where he had once struggled to survive as a homeless outcast. "It's knowing that other people who have been destroyed by corporate criminals now understand that fighting back is possible." His company's success had provided the resources and credibility necessary to establish the Technology Justice Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of intellectual property theft and corporate retaliation. The foundation provided legal assistance, technical resources, and most importantly, proof that even the most powerful criminal enterprises could be exposed and defeated by their own victims. The foundation's first major case had involved a group of former Meridian Technologies employees who had been systematically silenced through non-disclosure agreements and financial settlements. Marcus's legal team had found ways to void those agreements based on evidence that they had been obtained through criminal coercion, allowing the victims to speak publicly about their experiences for the first time. "Robert stopped by this morning while you were in the board meeting," Sarah mentioned, smiling as she referenced Marcus's homeless friend who had taught him crucial survival skills during his darkest period. "He wanted to thank you again for the consulting position and to let you know that his housing situation is finally stable." The Technology Justice Foundation had also become a vehicle for helping other victims of economic displacement rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Robert's expertise in aircraft navigation systems had made him a valuable consultant for companies developing autonomous vehicle technology, while Elena's medical background had led to a position helping develop healthcare applications for underserved communities. Everyone deserves a second chance, Marcus said, remembering his own desperate months of trying to survive while society treated him as invisible and worthless. The foundation exists to make sure that victims of systematic abuse have the resources they need to fight back and rebuild. The personal transformation Marcus had undergone during his journey from victim to entrepreneur to advocate had been as profound as his professional success. The naive developer who had trusted in institutional fairness had been replaced by someone who understood that real justice often required individuals to take extraordinary risks in service of broader principles. But the change hadn't made him cynical or bitter. Instead, it had given him a deeper appreciation for the power of human resilience and the importance of using success to help others who face similar challenges. The homeless months had taught him that society's most vulnerable people often possessed hidden capabilities that could be remarkable when given proper support and opportunity. "Your parents called while you were out," Sarah said, handing him a message that brought a smile to his face. "They want to confirm dinner plans for this weekend and to tell you how proud they are of everything you've accomplished." The reconciliation with his family had been one of the most meaningful aspects of his recovery from Whitmore's systematic destruction. His parents had never fully understood the technical details of his persecution or the legal complexities of his vindication, but they recognized that their son had faced extraordinary challenges with courage and determination that honored the sacrifices they had made to give him opportunities in America. They still can't quite believe that their boy went from sleeping on the streets to running a $50 million company, Marcus said, remembering the tears in his mother's eyes when she first visited his new office and understood the scope of what he had rebuilt from nothing. The success felt surreal sometimes, but Marcus had learned to accept it as the natural result of combining technical innovation with the focused determination that came from having nothing left to lose. His algorithms had succeeded not just because of their mathematical sophistication, but because they incorporated insights about human behavior under stress that he never could have gained from a position of comfort and security. Late in the afternoon, as his employees began leaving for the day and the office grew quiet, Marcus found himself drawn back to the framed napkin on his wall, the makeshift business card that had represented his first tentative step back toward respectability and success. The simple sketch had become the foundation for something much larger than he had ever imagined possible. The Technology Justice Foundation occupied the entire floor below his company's offices, its staff working daily to help victims of corporate abuse find the resources and courage necessary to fight back against systematic oppression. The foundation's success had inspired similar organizations in other cities, creating a network of advocates who understood that individual cases of abuse were often part of larger patterns that required coordinated response. "Sometimes I think about that moment outside Le Bernardin," Marcus said to Sarah as she prepared to leave for the day, "when Whitmore dropped that $20 bill and told me to clean his shoes for leftovers. He was so confident that he had permanently broken me. Instead, he created his own worst nightmare," Sarah replied. "Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He thought he was humiliating a defeated man, but he was actually motivating someone who would eventually destroy his entire criminal empire. The irony was perfect." Whitmore's casual cruelty had been intended to ensure Marcus's permanent silence and submission. Instead, it had forged him into someone capable of achieving justice, not just for himself, but for dozens of other victims who had been systematically silenced and destroyed. As Marcus prepared to leave his office for the evening, he took one last look at the city spread out below his windows. Somewhere in that urban landscape were other victims of corporate predation who felt hopeless and isolated, convinced that powerful adversaries could never be held accountable for their crimes. But Marcus's story proved otherwise. The homeless developer who had been mocked and humiliated outside an expensive restaurant had become a successful entrepreneur whose greatest achievement was demonstrating that systematic abuse could be defeated through patient planning, technical competence, and absolute commitment to justice. The napkin on his wall would always remind him that extraordinary outcomes could emerge from the most humble beginnings. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply refusing to remain silent and broken, even when the world seemed determined to keep you that way. Walking out into the San Francisco evening, Marcus Chen carried with him the quiet satisfaction of someone who had transformed his deepest humiliation into his greatest triumph. The journey from homeless outcast to corporate executive to advocate for justice had been longer and more difficult than he could have imagined, but it had also been more meaningful and impactful than his original comfortable career had ever promised to be. Whitmore had intended to destroy him completely, but had instead created something much more dangerous, a champion for every victim of systematic abuse who had ever been told they were powerless to fight back. The sound of handcuffs closing around his tormentor's wrists would echo in Marcus's memory forever, not as an ending, but as proof that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it's justice that has become more powerful through patient preparation and unwavering determination. The boy who had immigrated to America with his parents' dreams of opportunity had become a man who created opportunities for others to seek justice and rebuild their lives with dignity. The simple napkin sketch that had started as a desperate attempt to appear professional had evolved into a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were too broken to fight back. And in the end, that transformation was worth more than any amount of money or professional recognition. It was proof that even the cruelest abuse of power could ultimately be defeated by its own victims when they refused to accept that defeat was permanent.